Most people expect an explosion. That's the story we're conditioned to imagine when someone finally sees through a narcissist completely, and a dramatic confrontation, a furious denial, a scene loud enough to match the size of what's just been uncovered. That's what happens with the obvious kind, the grandiose kind, the ones who need an audience even for their downfall. It is almost never what happens with a covert narcissist. When you unmask one of these, something much stranger and much quieter happens instead. They run, but not loudly, not with a slammed door or a screaming match or a public scene that gives you something dramatic to point to later as proof of what you saw. They run the same way they did almost everything else in the relationship. Silently, indirectly, in a way specifically designed to leave you doubting whether anything actually happened at all. If you've loved a covert narcissist, you already know how different this type is from the version most people picture when they hear the word narcissist. There's no obvious grandiosity, no visible arrogance, no room-commanding charisma that makes the pattern easy to spot from a distance. A covert narcissist is soft-spoken, often self-deprecating, frequently positioned as the sensitive one, the misunderstood one, the person who's been hurt so many times they've had to build quiet walls just to survive. This isn't an act in the way people usually imagine manipulation working, carefully calculated, performed with conscious intent. For many covert narcissists, this really is how they experience themselves, which makes them exponentially harder to see clearly and exponentially more disorienting to finally unmask. Here's what makes covert narcissism so uniquely difficult to detect in the first place, because understanding this is the key to understanding why the unmasking produces such a specific, quiet reaction rather than an explosive one. Grandiose narcissism operates through obvious self-inflation, bragging, dominating conversations, an unmistakable need to be admired that most people learn to recognize relatively quickly. Covert narcissism operates through something almost the opposite on the surface: self-deprecation, victimhood, a persistent narrative of being wronged, misunderstood, or mistreated by nearly everyone in their life. But underneath that surface, the actual psychological engine is identical. Both types are organized around an unstable, externally dependent sense of self that requires constant validation to feel secure. The grandiose narcissist gets that validation through admiration. The covert narcissist gets it through sympathy, through being seen as the perpetual victim whose pain justifies almost any behavior, through a quieter but equally persistent demand that everyone around them center their feelings above almost anything else in the room. This is why unmasking a covert narcissist feels so different from unmasking the grandiose kind. You're not catching them in an obvious lie about how great they are. You're catching them in something much subtler, noticing over time that the victimhood never resolves no matter how much support they receive, that the self-deprecation somehow always redirects attention back toward them rather than genuinely inviting connection, that every conflict, regardless of the actual facts, somehow ends with them positioned as the one who suffered most. Once you see this pattern clearly, once you stop taking the victim narrative at face value and start noticing the function it's actually serving, something shifts in how you interact with them. And a covert narcissist feels that shift almost immediately, even before you've said a single confrontational word. This is the first thing worth understanding about the quiet run. It often begins before any direct confrontation happens at all, because covert narcissists are, in a strange way, exceptionally attuned to the emotional undercurrents of the people around them, not out of genuine empathy, but out of a hyper-vigilant need to monitor whether the sympathy and validation they depend on is still being reliably extended. The moment you stop offering automatic sympathy for the latest story of how unfairly they've been treated, the moment your face shows the faintest flicker of skepticism instead of the reflexive compassion you used to offer without question, they notice, not consciously in most cases, but somewhere in the same hypervigilant system that spent years scanning for threats to their supply, an alarm goes off. And here's what makes the covert narcissist's response to that alarm so different from the grandiose narcissist's response to the same threat. Instead of escalating, demanding, forcing a confrontation to reassert control the way a grandiose narcissist typically would. A covert narcissist tends to withdraw, quietly, incrementally, in a way specifically calibrated to avoid ever having to have the direct conversation that would require acknowledging what's actually happening. This withdrawal can look like a dozen different things depending on the specific relationship, becoming harder to reach, redirecting conversations away from anything substantive, developing a sudden vague explanation for distance that never quite adds up to a full account of what's actually going on. What it almost never looks like is an honest acknowledgement that they've been seen clearly and don't know how to handle it. This is the quiet running, and it's worth understanding why it happens this way instead of through direct confrontation, because the reason reveals something important about covert narcissism specifically. A grandiose narcissist, when unmasked, often has enough confidence in their own performance to attempt outright denial, aggressive counteraccusation, a full frontal defense of the persona you've just seen through. A covert narcissist typically doesn't have access to that same confidence because their entire self-concept is built on fragility rather than grandiosity, which means direct confrontation is genuinely more dangerous for them. It risks a conversation where the victim narrative might not hold up under close examination, where they might be asked direct questions they don't have honest answers to. Retreat protects them from that risk in a way that a loud confrontation never could. This retreat has a specific shape to it, and once you recognize it, you'll never mistake it for anything else again. It rarely happens all at once. It happens in layers, each one designed to preserve just enough plausible deniability that the covert narcissist never has to say out loud, "I'm leaving because you finally saw through me." Because saying that would require the one thing their entire psychology is built to avoid: direct acknowledgement of the manipulation, spoken in their own voice, with no victim narrative available to soften it. The first layer is almost always a subtle rewriting of the relationship's emotional temperature. Suddenly, you're different, colder, less understanding than you used to be. This reframe serves a critical function because it allows the covert narcissist to begin distancing themselves while simultaneously recasting the distance as you're doing rather than theirs. Notice the elegance of this move. It doesn't require them to defend anything specific because it isn't actually addressing what you've noticed. It's shifting the entire frame of the conversation away from their behavior and onto your supposed change in temperament, which conveniently happens to have occurred at exactly the moment you stopped extending automatic sympathy to a pattern you finally recognized. The second layer is a quiet reduction in emotional availability that arrives without any clear explanation attached to it. Conversations get shorter. Vulnerability disappears from interactions that used to be full of it. Where they once shared their inner world freely, often as a way of generating the sympathy their supply depended on, they now offer surface-level exchanges only, careful, guarded, revealing almost nothing. This isn't them protecting themselves from genuine hurt in the way it might initially appear. It's a retreat from exposure, because vulnerability was always, on some level, a tool rather than simply an act of trust, and a tool stops being deployed once it stopped generating the return it used to reliably produce. The third layer, and this is often the one that confuses people most, is the sudden emergence of a new source of sympathy entirely separate from you. A new friend, a new confidant, sometimes a new romantic interest, who seems to appear with almost eerie timing right around the same period you started seeing through the old pattern clearly. This isn't coincidental, even though it's rarely announced as a deliberate strategy. A covert narcissist experiencing the loss of a reliable source of sympathy doesn't typically sit in that loss the way a healthier person might, reflecting on what happened and why. They redirect quickly toward wherever a fresh supply of uncomplicated validation seems available, because sitting in the discomfort of having been seen clearly is, for this particular psychological structure, close to intolerable. Here's what makes all three of these layers particularly disorienting if you're the one watching them unfold. None of it comes with an explanation, and none of it invites the direct conversation that would actually resolve anything. You're left holding the accurate perception you finally developed, the clear-eyed understanding that you've been dealing with a pattern of manipulation dressed up as vulnerability, while simultaneously being denied any opportunity to discuss it openly because the person retreating is doing everything in their power to avoid ever having that conversation happen. This can produce a strange, specific kind of self-doubt, even in someone who's finally seen the pattern with total clarity. You start wondering if you imagined the significance of what you saw, precisely because the person who should be reacting to being unmasked is instead behaving as though nothing notable happened at all, just a gradual, unexplained drift that could theoretically mean almost anything. This is worth naming directly because it's one of the cruelest parts of dealing with a covert narcissist's quiet retreat. The ambiguity itself becomes a final tool of manipulation, even if it isn't consciously deployed as one. A loud, dramatic reaction to being unmasked would at least confirm, unmistakably, that you saw something real. The quiet retreat denies you even that confirmation, leaving you to sit with your own accurate perception without the validation of watching it land visibly on the other person. Many empaths describe this specific phase as harder in some ways than dealing with the more obvious cruelty of a grandiose narcissist's rage, precisely because there's nothing dramatic to point to, nothing that clearly proves what actually happened. Just an unexplained cooling that could, if you let self-doubt take over, be reinterpreted as something else entirely. Your imagination, your own coldness, a natural drift that has nothing to do with the pattern you finally saw clearly. But here's what's actually happening underneath that ambiguous surface, and understanding it clearly is one of the most protective things you can do for your own peace during this phase. The retreat is the confirmation. The absence of a direct conversation, the sudden redirection toward new sources of sympathy, the subtle reframing that casts you as the one who changed. All of it is exactly what you'd expect from someone whose psychological survival depends on never having to consciously face what you've just seen. A person with nothing to hide, confronted with an accurate but mistaken accusation, generally wants to have the direct conversation, wants to clear things up, wants to understand why the relationship suddenly feels different. A person whose entire pattern has just been accurately identified and who has no honest defense against that identification avoids the conversation entirely because the conversation itself is the actual threat, regardless of how it might go. This is the piece worth holding on to most tightly if you're currently living through this exact retreat, watching someone you once trusted quietly drift away without ever giving you the direct reckoning you might feel entitled to after everything you gave the relationship. You do not need their confirmation in order for your perception to be valid. This matters more than it might initially seem to, because so much of what makes covert narcissism uniquely disorienting is the way it trains you over the entire relationship to distrust your own read of a situation in favor of whatever explanation is being offered instead, usually some version of their own hurt feelings, positioned as the thing that actually needs addressing, regardless of what you originally raised. The quiet retreat is, in its own way, the final version of that exact same training. It's asking you implicitly to doubt what you saw simply because no one is standing in front of you loudly confirming it. But absence of confirmation is not the same as absence of truth, and learning to hold that distinction clearly is one of the most important skills you can develop after loving someone whose entire strategy depended on you never quite trusting your own perception enough to act on it without their validation first. Here's what's genuinely worth understanding about what happens next on the covert narcissist side of this quiet unraveling, because it explains something that might otherwise feel deeply unsatisfying about an ending with no dramatic confrontation attached to it. The retreat doesn't actually resolve anything for them, even though it looks from the outside like a clean, low-conflict way of avoiding a difficult conversation. Because the underlying need to be seen as the perpetual sympathetic victim, to have that narrative accepted without question by the people closest to them, doesn't disappear just because they've successfully avoided confronting the fact that it stopped working with you specifically. It simply gets redirected toward a new audience who hasn't yet learned to see through it, restarting a nearly identical cycle with someone new, someone earlier in the process of being drawn in than you were by the time you finally recognize the pattern. This means the quiet retreat you're witnessing isn't actually a resolution on their end. It's an avoidance. And avoidance, unlike genuine resolution, doesn't produce growth. It simply buys time before the same underlying dynamic repeats itself with someone else, someone who will, in all likelihood, spend their own months or years slowly learning to recognize the same soft-spoken victimhood you eventually learn to see through before reaching their own version of this exact moment, the moment where their sympathy stops flowing automatically and the covert narcissist once again quietly begins to drift. For you, though, standing on this side of the unmasking, what matters isn't whether they ever circle back to confirm what happened, and it isn't whether the next person in line eventually reaches the same clarity you did. What matters is that you saw it, clearly, accurately, without needing their permission or their confession to know it was real. That clarity is the actual outcome of this entire story, regardless of how quietly or ambiguously the retreat unfolds around it. You don't need a dramatic confrontation to validate what you already know. You don't need them to acknowledge the pattern out loud in order for your recognition of it to be complete and trustworthy. If you're in the middle of this right now, watching someone drift away in vague, unexplained layers, wondering whether you imagined the significance of what finally clicked into place, second-guessing whether your own perception can be trusted without their confirmation standing behind it, I want you to trust exactly what you saw. The quiet running isn't evidence that nothing happened. It's the specific, predictable signature of someone whose entire psychological survival depends on never having to consciously face what you finally clearly understood about them. Loud confrontation would have required them to defend something. Quiet retreat lets them avoid the defense entirely, which tells you more clearly than any argument could exactly how little defense they actually had. You don't need them to run loudly for the unmasking to be real. Sometimes the quietest exit is the loudest confession there is. A person who, faced with finally being seen clearly, chose disappearance over honesty, because honesty was never something their psychology was built to survive offering you in the first place. Thanks for watching.